I had an idea to mix two completely different concepts and see what I could come up with. I thought it would be interesting to see how potentially Orbit chewing gum could be rebranded if it had a more fantasy/magical feel to it. The obvious thing here is that I still had to make sure it felt like Orbit and it could be a product that they potentially launch. I had a vision of using magical elements like gold dust and runes, along with some Harry Potter inspired aesthetics. But I thought it would be quite interesting to use the Deathly Hallows aesthetic as a reference point and then build from there. I also thought about having it set in space to tie into the literal definition of orbits and potentially having some celestial bodies. I like this version of the Orbit logo as the font and shapes, once converted into a stroke, could potentially work quite nicely as the Deathly Hallows concept. Having each of the characters split vertically just gives it a bit more character. I brought the Orbit logo into Illustrator. The first thing is to convert it into a vector. I did an image trace which converts the PNG into individual shapes which can then be edited as needed. I was trying to rebuild the Deathly Hallows within the Orbit's O, and my first attempt just made me sick. I tried to rebuild it a number of times, but for the life of me I couldn't get it to work. I even added a little bit of colour to it, but it just looked completely wrong. So I went back to the drawing board. As you've seen, I've also removed the fill from the trace logo to create the stroke. I scrapped the old design and decided to redo the Deathly Hallows and scale it so it works. I brought down the size of the O to match the smaller letters, otherwise it will be too large and mess up the balance. The triangle was scaled to the size of the larger letters, and I knew already that this was a big improvement on the previous design. I finished it up and brought it into a Photoshop canvas I had prepared. The navy in the background is the same navy used on the Orbit logo. I did darken it to create a bit more contrast and to make it feel a bit more like space. I grouped all the elements, creating a clipping mask layer above. This will let me recolor the logo on the fly. I find it easier to work like this. I played with the colors for a while and ultimately set on a white majority with a couple pale gold hotspots for color. This gave the logo a little bit more character as opposed to being just monotone. I tweaked the scale of the name Wrigley's and placed it as it would have been on the original logo. You can see a big difference in the two logo variations. Now that the focus of the rebrand is ready, which is obviously the logo, I can now focus on paying attention to the other details and to develop the design. On the Orbit branding, they have this circular shape covering the left half of the packaging. These circles play into the idea of orbits, so I thought about how I could potentially use this. I was brainstorming some ideas on what else felt magical, and I landed on the idea of runes. Runes are a type of language typically associated with sort of magic in fantasy shows and stuff, and I thought this could add some great details to the packaging. I went onto FreePic and saw some runic letters. The idea is to create them in slightly increasing circles to visualize the idea of an orbit. A little play on the name while also using an element that the brand is familiar with. In Illustrator, I rearranged them and closed the spacing. I added key lines above and below the letters and rounded the edges. This is to create a brush pattern using these shapes, which will then be placed onto a circle shape. I highlighted the lettering and expanded the selection. Once grouped and scaled, I opened the brush panel. If you don't know where this is, you can find this on the Windows brush. I then clicked the small plus and then pattern brush. I thought everything looked fine from the dialog box, so I clicked OK. I created a circle. From the brushes panel, select the new pattern I just created and I removed the fill. As you can see, you're left with this really nice circular runic type. The great thing about this is that it's completely reactive, so if you do not get it perfect on the first try, you can scale the shape and have the pattern adjust until you're happy. I brought this into the Photoshop project as a smart object so it retains the information. I placed these in orbit around the O in the logo, changed the color to a slightly lighter navy from the background. I copied these circle runes a couple times and increased the scale to visualize the orbit a planet or entity might have in a magical way. These are meant to be very faint details in the background. Later on, with each large runic orbit, I reduced the opacity so that the focus gets drawn into the O of the logo. Now that it's feeling more magical-ish, I need to jazz it up. As I mentioned before, I took a little bit of inspiration from Hogwarts. So in the game, there is a wisp of magic whenever you use the Pathfinder. This made me kind of want to use gold dust. I went onto Google and grabbed a gold dust element and brought it into Photoshop. The great thing about this is that it also looks like stars, which plays into the idea of space. I changed the blend mode to screen and adjusted the scale slightly, then reduced the opacity and masked out some of the details around the key parts of the logo, freeing up space so that it's not too busy and easy to identify. I then created a new layer on top of the gold dust, set the blend mode to soft light, and with a gold brush added some glow to a few of the stars, bringing some of the details to life. Now, because I'm doing some product packaging, I needed to bring in some details around the product itself. Orbit generally has information on the flavor and the number of sticks within a pack. I thought this would be great information to add onto the packaging. I did a quick Google on Harry Potter flavors and landed on cinnamon. Thought this would work great with the highlight color being gold. Using the same font used in Wrigley's and using the same placement from the original packaging, I added the details. I then needed to visualize that this is indeed chewing gum and not anything else. So taking the typical rectangular shape Orbit makes their gum in, I created it in Illustrator using a normal rectangle and rounding the edges. Bringing this back into the Photoshop canvas and alternating between gold and white gum shapes to look like celestial objects floating around space, I added a Gaussian blur to these to give the illusion of depth. I added the number of pieces in the pack at the bottom and centered it horizontally to finish the packaging. I didn't want to add too much and overkill the design. I wanted it to feel classy and sleek whilst retaining the qualities about Magic and Orbit's original design. I think this turned out pretty well. Hope you all enjoyed and took something away from this video. It would be great to hear what you think, so feel free to leave some comments down below. If you have any pointers about anything, I'm all ears. I am trying to be more consistent and post more regularly, so keep an eye out for more designs. Till the next one, peace.